So Andrew, it is the spring, and it is the season for both Passover and Easter, which, unlike Hanukkah and Christmas, don't coincide simply sort of by chance. Right? These are actually deeply interwoven holidays for Judaism and Christianity. And so what we're going to do in the next few sessions here is talk about where the holidays come from, their biblical origins, and then their post-biblical developments, how they turned into the practices that we have today, or something close to them. Passover obviously came first. But as you well know, Passover wasn't always exactly the Passover that we think of today.
Right.
Right? Like so many of the festivals in the Hebrew Bible especially, it has an agricultural background to it. And was originally not one festival, but actually probably was two, right?
Okay, so I mean, one can see this with some careful reading in Exodus, for instance, even just if you're clued into the suspicion that there are two things going on, because sometimes it refers to observing Passover, and then sometimes it talks about this thing called a Feast of Unleavened Bread.
Right, and sometimes they do so completely separately, right? There's reference to observing the Feast of Unleavened Bread with no mention of Passover, and sometimes it talks about observing the Passover without worrying about the unleavened bread at all.
And sometimes they're right literally on the same plate, though, because, for instance, when the instruction for observing the Passover in homes in Exodus 12, I think, it talks about eating the Passover with unleavened bread. So if there's been some kind of mashup of two traditions, it's well and truly on the plate there, right?
That's right. That's right. It is consumed as part of the meal. But you can see actually in Exodus 12, which is really where most people are going to first encounter this, right? We're reading the story of the Exodus, and we come to obviously the crucial moment where we have the death of the firstborn and the final plague, and obviously the story of God saying to Moses, I'm going to go through and I'm going to destroy all of the Egyptians, but you should put the blood on your house so that I know to pass over you, which is where we get the name Passover from. And then there's actually, it's interrupted by some quite lengthy descriptions of exactly how we're supposed to take care of find a lamb, and we're supposed to take care of it, and then how we're supposed to slaughter it. And it sort of interrupts the story, but it's clearly the basis for the practice of what we now think of as Passover. Even there in Exodus 12, you can see it comes in two distinct parts. There's what to do with this lamb that's being sacrificed, including eating it with unleavened bread. And then there's a whole thing about you not eating leavened bread, right? Which is where you see the sort of the two things coming together. So I am pretty confident that the Feast of Unleavened Bread is originally an agricultural sort of observation. I am not entirely sure what we now call the Passover is, right? The Pesach. Do you have any sense of what this might have been?
Well, let's sort of look at it from shall we say, a kind of naive or literal point of view. It obviously, the Passover part is a more historically framed feast. It's got a narrative attached to it. It's supposed to be about things that took place not on a cyclical basis through an agricultural year, but things that took place at one point in history. Now this, of course, doesn't actually solve the problem, but it just sharpens it, because, of course, the historical realities that lie behind those things are very contestable, shall we say, to say the least. But I wonder, given you asked me the question, I can really only ask it back. It's not hard to see how an agricultural festival might come into existence, although I'd like to ask you more about why you think it's one of unleavened bread and so forth. But is it possible that there might have been another festival that sort of didn't just get sort of created at one point in history out of whole cloth, but rather also had more distant agrarian roots, that people used to slaughter a lamb once a year or something like that? Yeah,
I mean, it's incredibly hard to know. The Bible gives us absolutely no indication of what the Pesach might have been previous to its use in this way. The word Pesach, which we translate as Passover, actually probably doesn't mean that.
Okay.
Right? It probably means something like protect.
Okay.
Right. So when we say God is going to pass over the houses, it probably was originally God is going to protect the houses.
But it still means something that's connected to the significance of the feast. It isn't just, an arbitrary piece of language.
Sure. But I can imagine there having been an annual sacrifice, something like a Thanksgiving offering for God having protected the community for the past year.
Yeah.
and then that getting sucked into the narrative of the Exodus, which of course became sort of the primary
Yes.
narrative of the people.
Yeah.
So I guess my point is, I think neither part of what we now call Passover was probably originally connected to the events of the Exodus that they now commemorate.
Right.
I think you had an annual sacrifice of Thanksgiving probably for protection, and I think we had an agricultural festival. I'm not entirely sure why unleavened bread becomes a thing, although we do have in the Bible, right, the notion of not eating last year's grain for a certain period to sort of cycle it through, and perhaps eating unleavened bread has to do with that to some extent, right, with cycling through the past year's produce.
Okay, that makes sense. I'm also interested in bread making, as you may know, and I think that it also would make sense if, for instance, there was, for some reason, whose roots might have lain in a sort of domestic common sense, that every year you should throw out your yeast supply. It's not really yeast in modern sense, it's more like your sourdough starter, and start again. There are other cultures today where people do this on a kind of annual basis, that they create their new starter for the year at some festival. And if you're going to do that annually, there's actually this implicit moment when we haven't got any starter, what are we going to do? We're going to have to eat unleavened bread. So eating unleavened bread as a sort of ritualized consequence of the fact that you may feel that your bread processes need to be renewed each year. It's not too hard to work out how that could come into being in a very prosaic way, although obviously the stories that get attached to this are more interesting than merely prosaic things about, well, the grain's a bit stale, let's start again.
Yeah, sure. I think that biblically, though Exodus 12 is the first place we encounter Passover, probably the oldest reference to any part of it maybe in the festival laws you find in the Exodus 23, where there's only reference to sort of the pilgrimage feast, which is unleavened bread. And it's in Deuteronomy that I think for the first time sort of historically within the composition of the text, Deuteronomy is the first one to say, these things go together, right? This Passover sacrifice and the unleavened bread. And probably Deuteronomy, the author of Deuteronomy, was the one who was first reading the story in Exodus of the Israelites having to flee. And therefore not having time for their bread to rise. I think Deuteronomy is the first one to read that and say, that's the hinge, right? That's where the Exodus story becomes the unleavened bread story.
So another story that actually has to do with unleavened bread, but maybe for different reasons.
Right.
Because there are other references again to unleavened bread. There were other times when people would eat unleavened bread simply because it was the cheapest and quickest way to produce food. I mean, there's a story in Genesis. I don't know whether it's as old as some of the others, but I think Abraham and Sarah make unleavened bread to put before visitors, for instance, because of course you can do it on the spot.
That's exactly right. And so yes, I think the practice of eating unleavened bread doesn't originate with this story, but it again was sort of brought into it. Being originally an agricultural festival. My guess is that originally, like many festivals in the Bible, Passover wasn't originally connected to any particular specific date. Though again, when we read Exodus 12, right, it says, right, on the 10th of the first month you're to do this, on the 14th you're to do this, and then you celebrate for 8 days. And so it's got the calendar built in. We're going to be talking in a future session about sort of how the calendars work with these holidays. But again, I think I wanted to point out that the holiday didn't sort of emerge fully formed, as it were, right? You can see in different layers of the Bible the way that it progressed and became sort of more fixed, and its particularities, such that by the time you get to what we think of as sort of these ritual texts in Leviticus 23, Numbers 28, we have not just sort of the story of what of the Exodus. We don't even have that. What we have is instruction about exactly how many lambs you're supposed to slaughter and exactly what time. And it's fully, become part of a ritual calendar. But the one we read in Exodus, you couldn't take that one and then replicate it, right. At home.
Because it's got unique elements because of the narrative that's accompanying it, right?
That's right. The framing of it, right? It's set in Egypt. It's set at a time when there's no temple, right? So you can't do the sacrifice the normal way.
Yes, and that's intriguing for me because everything about it looks as if it's a domestic ritual. Do you think that that's the real origins, or do you think that that's a kind of a narrative frame that's put around something people would otherwise have actually experienced as a sacrifice like other sacrifices. Because it is rather different in the procedure that's given as well.
Right. I mean, I think that what we have in the story in Exodus 12, it looks like a home sacrifice almost, which is not a thing that really existed at a,
But at least it doesn't exist in the other traditions we know.
Right. It would be very strange to find a sacrifice not done at a sanctuary somewhere. But of course, in the world of the story, there's no sanctuary to do it at.
Right.
So my suspicion is, again, historically, the Passover, the Pesach sacrifice would have taken place at a local sanctuary. And of course, not eating leavened bread, which is the bulk of what you do during the Festival of Unleavened Bread, that can be done anywhere. So that's the home part, right? Is you clean the leaven out of your house.
Right, that's certainly domestic.
Right, and that remains so. Certainly, once we have a temple in the rabbinic period, when they're looking back at the temple, the texts we have from there make clear that the Passover sacrifice took place at the temple, not in the home. So I think that we can't take the story in Exodus 12 or the ritual described in Exodus 12 and simply convert it into, oh, well, that's exactly what we're supposed to do.
Right.
What it really is like, the best analogy, to my mind, is when we tell the story of sort of the first Thanksgiving, right, with the Pilgrims and the Native Americans sitting around, we don't then say, all right, everybody, go replicate that exactly.
Find your bush turkey and your succotash.
Right, we tell the story and then say, and that's why we do what we do today.
Yeah, there are other parallels to that too. I mean, we'll come back perhaps to talk about, Jesus' Last Supper and Passover. And in fact, early Christians who gathered for meals that are supposedly sort of recreations and celebrations of Jesus' Last Supper don't do the things that are described at the Last Supper either. So it's quite plausible for a story to be the inspiration of a particular practice without necessarily being a strict ritual model.
Right. I'm glad you bring up the New Testament and the Last Supper. I think we're going to talk about that a little bit in the next session.
Good.
That's probably and right about enough on Passover itself.
Thanks.